This is a survey that was carried out by FES in partnership with the City of Bulawayo and with the Bulawayo Informal Sector Working Group. The idea behind that is to inform policy and planning for the city. Because, as we will possibly be aware already, the City of Bulawayo, together with the informal sector organizations, have been working on reforming the informal sector. We have seen some changes happening, and this is also based on the mayor's vision to support the transition of the informal sector to a bit more formalization, and most importantly, the establishment of more modern markets. As FES, we supported this study because we believe that the informal sector is a very key sector in the socio-economic and political matrix of Zimbabwe. And we also work on social justice. So the issue of informal traders is not just an economic issue, but it's also a social justice issue because it brings to its fore social inequalities that are there in our society. If you look at the profiles of the people who are selling wares on the street, you'll find a lot of different social identities, but what underscores all of that is the inequality that is then pushing them into the streets. So it's a social justice issue for us, and we take that very seriously. Considering that Zimbabwe is facing huge levels of unemployment, what's clear is that the informal sector is not going anywhere. And what's also clear, which is acknowledged by all stakeholders, is that the informal sector is a key contributor to the economic growth and economic development of Zimbabwe. What is missing at this point is a concomitant action following that realization that then positions the informal sector both in terms of policy as well as in terms of practice, in terms of programming, and maybe more broadly in terms of attitudes, which enable them to thrive and to contribute to the growth of society. Of course, there are various challenges faced by the informal sector, most of which this study then tackles. What we hope to do is that the study enables the city to plan from an informed perspective, that the study also becomes a starting point for sustained dialogue between the city fathers and the informal sector, and also between all the other different stakeholders and the informal sector, following evidence-based advocacy. So in that regard, we are gathered here today to then receive a presentation of the report of that survey, which started in February, and today we are then presenting that. And some of you were involved in that study, and most of us were also participating from the inception meeting to the data collection to the validation workshop that we had. All of that for us underscores the importance of stakeholder engagement, underscores the realization that the informal economy issues are not one-dimensional issues. They are multifaceted. They are also issues that cannot be solved by one stakeholder. Every stakeholder at different levels of society and in different sectors holds a piece of the solution. So it is based on that realization that we have seen it fit to continuously create the platforms throughout the life cycle of the study where the stakeholders engage. Going forward, we hope that we can then take up the findings of the study and have further programming which is informed by those findings.
My name is Ruth Chomola, and I am the consultant who was leading the study. Thank you so much for the support. The opportunity was a great one. We had great engagements. Yes, we faced some challenges here and there, but we managed to pull through and also came up with very interesting findings that would very much inform policy and also even the establishment of the new market spaces that are being proposed by council. So basically our study was based on the following themes. These were the demographic profile of street vendors. We wanted to appreciate the demography so that we also inculcate those findings in the planning and also be able to accommodate the different people that are engaging in street vending. We also were targeting the social and economic realities of street vendors. This is also where we are actually asking around the issues of profit, the cost of startup, social security and issues around those. Then also we wanted to facilitate a conversation around the decent work agenda. This is whereby we are saying we need to prioritize and appreciate that street vendors are also workers and they have their rights that also need to be communicated and also respected by all duty bearers. So mainly what we were able to also achieve is to come up with an understanding of the types and forms of businesses or street vendors in Bulawayo. Then also the state of compliance. On this component, we were looking at the attitudes towards regularization, formalization, and also with a conversation with both licensed and unlicensed street vendors to better appreciate really the positioning around the challenges faced in licensing and also the opportunities that could be used by the city fathers in attracting and incentivizing street vendors towards them being regularized. Also, we wanted to identify gender-specific needs and challenges faced by informal traders. So basically, these are the themes that informed the study and even the design of the tools. So on the research design, basically we used simultaneous mix methods. This is us making use of qualitative and quantitative methods to gather data simultaneously at the same time. We also used adaptive cluster sampling. So we identified our sites at the inception meeting for those who managed to be there. And from those sites, we were able to come up with samples. But then we had to adapt to the size of each sample size for us to come up with a conclusive one. And then for the site observation, this was mainly used to triangulate our findings and also have a conversation with site committee members that were already at the sites. Then we also used thematic analysis based on the themes that I have already attributed to. And then also we had site observation, whereby we also went around just to appreciate what was going around in the streets. And also we need to take note that the time of the study also was during the exercise of the decongestion. So we also faced some challenges also even in the distribution of our enumerators. We also had focus group discussions that I'm gathering most of us were also part of, and individual questionnaires that were now being distributed by our enumerators. So basically this was our data collection, the inception and even the enumerators at work and also the thematic analysis. These are the sites that we were able to cover. Heritage Tepo, area Heads and Hooves, Topaz, Fortwell, Hyper and Bulawayo Center, City Hall, Le Max Garage area, 6th Avenue and Lobengula Street, side 6 Lobengula Street between 6th and 8th, Kusabamba Leopold Takawira to Heritage Tepo, then Leopold Takawira, Edgar's Chicken in that area around Trade Gold. Then site 5 and North along Avenue, 6th Avenue extension, including Bactars. And then Marcos site, the 5th Avenue Market. So these were the places we identified as where there is high centralization of farmer street vendors. And these were our target areas. So let's take note that the study only targeted street vendors and not informal built-up areas like malls or flea markets. We wanted those in the street only. Then data collection reached 437 females 246 meals, totaling 685, of which initially our target was 600. So we actually outdid ourselves in the data collection. This was done over 5 days from the 17th to the 21st of February 2024. That included Saturdays, that included the holiday. The target number for the qualified sample was 600 and we exceeded that one. So we also had 3 focus group discussions, of which participants were ranging from 5 to 8, and respondents were drawn from the Bulawayo Vendors Working Group, Bulawayo City Council, and the street vendors. So site mapping and site observation also showed us areas where there is high population density, proximity to rings, soccer beds, food outlets, and public institutions. So one of the major findings was if we are going to decongest the city and relocate the street vendors, we need to consider their push and pull factors. And these include areas where kulabantu abaningi, proximity to ranks, soccer beds, food outlets, and public institutions. So now I'm just going to run through our major findings. So more than 60% of the respondents depend heavily on street vending for livelihood. So it follows that the informal sector cannot be ignored in policy and programming. When I'm saying more than 60%, we are talking of people who have been in the streets for more than 5 years, some more than 15 years, who have dependents ranging from 3 and some up to 8, and others who also are managing to take their children to university using money and profits taken from street vending. Also, street vending is a reality that is not going to go away anytime soon, considering how some respondents have been selling in the streets for more than 15 years. Women continue to dominate the sector and represent about 64% of the informal street vendors in the CBD, men representing 36%. Considering previous statistics, this number is projected to increase as now more men are actually now going for the trade as compared to pre-colonial times. Only 31% of street vendors in the CBD are licensed, meaning that everyone else is not. So this can also be attributed to the phenomenon of transitory vendors. Those ones are from other towns just to sell their wares and go back. So they are not resident in the area and they are not interested basically in registering because of their movements, because they are not really throughout the year per se or throughout the month. There will be selected days maybe in the month. So on the state of compliance, council and vendors, they share a common understanding on the need to be regularized, the need for formalization, and the need for improved working conditions. So street vendors also express this commitment provided the benefits are attractive. This also came about when we went to even speak to the licensed vendors, and they were attributing to them paying but not seeing the benefits of paying for the licenses. So the commitment is there. What is not there is a component of transparency and accountability, and also seeing where the money is going. This we're talking about even the infrastructure developments, sanitary facilities, and even shades, because those yellow lines are not enough. And considering that people are paying for them, there has to be some form of development beyond the yellow lines. And then also the vendors have organized themselves into groups and social and economic solidarity groups. This reflects that street vendors are actually more organized than previously assumed, because the assumption was these are just people who are scattered. But we found that they have AMA Club, they've got funeral, Ozwood, and even grocery clubs, meaning that we can actually focus on such models and come up with a way to incentivize formalization processes. Then also there is need for continuous dialogue between the street vendors and relevant stakeholders. So we were also able to capture a lot of challenges, concerns, and even propose solutions that we documented in the report that will also be viable to even be implemented by different stakeholders. Of the recommendations, and then from there we're going to discuss more. So the first one, the first two pertain to legislation alignment in response to transitory vendors. And so the proposal was to review and align bylaws with the current environment. For example, the issue of transitory vendors. So this will mean coming up with a definitive term for them, designing a temporary permit that best accommodates their mobility traits, and setting up a market with specific business days for them. This is pertaining to the transitory vendors. Then also, we noticed that there was a gap, information gap, pertaining to what it entails to be licensed, the requirements, its responsibilities around such. So our recommendation is to raise awareness, review and update local authority bylaws for better compliance. This is with specific reference to Section 7 of the SI 180 of 2020 that speaks of the application of stalls, table holders, hawkers, vendors, license, or flea markets. Also on Section 11 that speaks to the application for stall or tables, the employer license, and amongst others. Then also Section 25 on the offenses and penalties, as we are also deliberating around coming up with severe spot fines to ensure compliance with the bylaws. Because it's not all of the bylaws that we are saying they are not serving their purpose, but now the issue comes to being on compliance. And then another recommendation was adaptation to new technologies. The recommendation being, let's utilize the new technologies to improve access to licensing and compliance, and also minimize corruption and rent-seeking practices. On this component, there was a discussion around how already the street vendors, some of them actually assume that they are licensed because they are paying $1 every day to not be raided. So for them, as far as they are concerned, they are okay. They are just being harassed. So that's why we're saying we want to raise awareness really on what entails compliance. And now we are saying let's use the new technologies to also ensure we cut the middlemen. Meaning that we can even come up with kiosks for payments, use of the website, for example, if there's a place so that people can pay online. So that we really don't have to be paying those individuals. So already this shows a commitment of sort to compliance by the street vendors. It's not all of them who enjoy this cat and mouse going on with municipality. Also, there is need for strengthened communication. On this component, we're talking about establishing clear and standardized communication channels with street vendors so that opportunities and other communication is well defined. So this will enable communication of updates of the bylaws for starters to ensure vendors are informed, because some, they are attested to not knowing really what is expected of them. So also communication will serve as a monitoring measure as it will force enhanced transparency and accountability. So this has to be some form of regular communication. Then we also identify that there is need for a formalization strategy. In as much as we'd want to formalize the sector, we also need to have a proper way of doing so, a standardized approach. So the recommendation is to develop a formalizing strategy for the city of Bulawayo to support and guide the transition from informal to formal economy guided by the ILO recommendations 204. So we are saying the transition is possible, the transition can be done, but we need to come up with an attractive means of doing it to enable that, not disenfranchise the street vendors from being able to earn their living as they are already doing, and also be able to decongest the city and bring back order to Bulawayo. So it is important for the transition mechanism to be less complicated, accessible, and attractive to both the council and the vendors, and also have some benefits. We need to incentivize the process So another recommendation also revolved around that there already are social solidarity groups within the street vendors. They have organized themselves. So it's saying, why not council or other stakeholders maximize on some of these things and provide social security and social protection for the vendors. Then we also spoke about the issue of markets. So we had the opportunity to speak to some of the licensed vendors, and their complaints revolved around compliance and having to compete with street vendors who are not complying. And also compliance that also does not equate to development, because there are no shades, there are no sanitation facilities, amongst others. So we need to also explore the listing of informal markets to associations to provide vendors with a sense of ownership, also enabling them to make improvements in the event that the city fathers cannot afford to do so. For example, a case in point is the Ngulumane Vegetable Wholesale Market established by BVTA. It shows that the model works and is applicable even to decongest the city. Then also the proposal came about, this one on developing on the markets. So from the survey, we found that the reason why street vendors are where they are is because they are people. They want people. Those are the clients that they are serving. And of which where there are many people, sport beds, chicken in, public institutions also attract large numbers of people. And ranks. For the ranks, this was a tricky one because this also meant both the legal and the illegal ranks. So now in the event that you'd want to attract them to other places where they would also want to go to, the proposal was also to introduce a mixed market approach model. This is whereby we are incorporating the formal markets and the informal markets. So it will have a setup whereby we have chicken in, we have sports beds, we also have maybe some public offices where people actually are able to go there. Then at the same time, we have bays and stations for our street vendors. So now to make it more attractive for them, they'll be cheaper because the ones paying more are the corporates, the bigger corporates. So this will also be able to decongest the city. And also for the already established license base, there is need for us to come up with some improvements of sorts. We cannot really depend on those lines only. There is need to come up with proper shades, access to water, access to sanitation facilities, to make it also attractive for the vendors. It will be easier to comply if you have such structures as compared to none. This also attributes to the issue of having gender-sensitive planning. We will need bathrooms for women, we will need changing rooms, we also need even incinerators if possible to collect menstrual papers and even the use of baby diapers. So we also want to ensure that these are clean environments that are also maintained in the state that they are. And this will also attract better compliance to the licensing procedures. Then we want to encourage relations with vendor associations. It was said to realize that majority of the street vendors are not affiliated with any of the associations. And we are assuming that the associations are serving a role in communicating the needs of the vendors to the city fathers and also coming back with feedback. So in the event that more than 70% are not represented by the associations, then communication is going to be a challenge. And so we are encouraging the associations also to be able to interact and try to come up with ways to attract working with the street vendors for easier communication and coordination with council. So also, this may also mean giving associations more roles, like assisting with licensing, so that they also play a role, because some also attested to how they've been assisted by their association chairmen to license and amongst other practices. Then also there's a recommendation that we use local housing offices outside of town for the licensing of street vendors, for the licensing of vendors, so that it's decongested. And even those who are saying they've been in the waiting list for years, this can also be able to buffer such. So this will enable ease of access to the service, less time spent on the waiting list, and ease pressure on personnel responsible for such within the council. Then there was another issue that was raised about sexual harassment that street vendors are also exposed to. So the recommendation is to facilitate conversations around the protection of all vendors against sexual harassment. The issue was around them being legal or not. Both are also have to be accommodated by the policy. So this will involve developing an anti-sexual harassment policy for the city, which applies to public spaces, and set up proper reporting structures so that we're able to follow up on these reports also. Then another grievance raised was the issue of people paying licensing and complying, but not seeing the benefits of such. And another possibility is maybe the lack of transparency and accountability in how the funds are used. So if we are going to use the communication channels established to also update the shareholders that the monies that you've contributed have gone towards this, some form of development and improvement, is also going to improve the levels of confidence in compliance. So there is need to act against corruption happening, especially with confiscated goods. Another issue raised was that when the municipality confiscates goods, they hand over to the police. Then when the vendors are trying to go to the police to locate their wares, no one seems to be accountable for where they've gone, and they end up losing their wares. So the proposal was also, if possible, to give the municipality arresting powers, meaning that they do not have to hand over to ZRP, but they're able to keep these wares under their jurisdiction so that even when the vendors come back to look for their goods, they're able to locate where and who collected them. Also, there is need for training of all the people who are going to engage with street vendors on human rights, to stop harassment, and also to capacitate on conflict resolution and communication. Then the main issue raised above all else was to strengthen implementation of bylaws. Bylaws are there and they serve a purpose. And now the issue is, how are we complying also as street vendors? So another suggestion was to come up with punitive spot fines that would deter street vendors from going back to those spots after paying the fines. So now, in the event that we have a fine of $60 if you are caught selling in the streets, and yet you are allocated a bay and license that's worth $12, already there's going to be preference for the $12 as compared to the $50 for non-compliance. So the cost of compliance and the cost of non-compliance really has to have a difference. So basically, these were the recommendations and the findings from the study. So in conclusion, we are saying street vending significantly impacts formal businesses, informal traders, and the local authorities' revenue potential. There are opportunities within that can be made use of, and there are also demerits that we are seeing, for example, the issue of corruption. So there's an opportunity for both in the event that we're able to take up the opportunities that are presented. Also, the council's proposal to construct modern markets is feasible and is able to address the challenges raised, and coupled with proper incentives towards transitioning to regularization, this will actually be a great model that can actually also be emulated in other cities. However, in as much as we want to decongest the city, we also need to appreciate that the street vendors are not there by choice. This is the economic situation that we are in. So we also need to make it attractive to them for them to comply. So this will also ensure regularization and formalization that addresses existing challenges and also promises and promotes improved working conditions. It has to be a mutually beneficial relationship. So this approach will also align with the decent work agenda, which aims to regularize the sector while assuring benefits for the vendors. Thank you very much.
the matters which have been discussed here, that have been identified in this report, are a key component of where the city proceeds to in future. And so in my mind, at least, the importance of this report and these recommendations are pivotal to the future direction of the city. With that in mind, I do want to, right at the start, pay tribute to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the German foundation which facilitated this report. We deeply appreciate the support that you've given to the city, and I'm grateful for your commitment to continue that support going forward. And at the end of my remarks, I'm going to be touching on how I feel we may be able to do that going forward. I'd also like to thank Ruth, the facilitator, for clearly what is an excellent report. It's very clear. They're clear-cut recommendations. Sometimes reports are very academic and fuzzy and too long. These are crisp. They identify the issues. They lay them out very clearly, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. But let me just touch on a few things in the report. One of the things that struck me was the length of time that many vendors have been involved in vending. I think if I'm correct, many vendors have been vending for 15 years. And as the report identifies, that means that this is not a temporary phenomenon. This is now the vendor's career. This is how they have ordered their lives and how they will order their lives in future. And that is also a reflection of the unfortunate reality of how the city has changed. Whether we like it or not, despite the fact that the city used to be an industrial hub of Southern Africa, it no longer is. And whilst we will do everything in our power to transform it back into becoming an industrial hub, we cannot simply wish away the current reality. And so we must not, as a city, think that this is some sort of temporary phenomenon. We need to plan as if this is going to be part of the city going forward. And let me say this, that I think that we all need to change our mindset regarding vending, to see that vendors can add considerable spice and flavor and color to the character of any city. In other words, we should not view vending as some sort of negative phenomenon, but more that this is part of the character of the city. And in that way, if we view it in a more positive light, I think that we can work much closer together between city and vendors, but even between those in the formal sector and the informal sector. If the formal sector sees that this informal sector vending can actually grow their own formal sector businesses rather than retard their businesses, then we get a far more constructive outlook towards vending. The other thing that struck me about the report was the percentage of women. If I remember, something like 64% are women. And that is a very important statistic for us to grasp. It's important in a number of ways. It's important because it's an indication that women are the most vulnerable in our society. They are less mobile than men. They find it harder, for example, to make a transition to Botswana or South Africa. They need to be close to their families. Perhaps they're more likely to look after aged parents than to look after their children. That needs to be recognized. Tied into that is the fact, as the report identifies, that as the city plans, we need to take into account that statistic. How do women vendors, particularly single mothers, look after their children? Is it a safe environment? This entire issue of sexual harassment is a very important consideration. And whilst sexual harassment happens in every sector, in the formal sector as well, women are particularly vulnerable in the informal sector because of the lack of structures in their work environment, which means that unscrupulous men have greater opportunities to indulge in sexual harassment of women. And that means we also have to take that into account in planning. And there are many other issues I don't have the time to go into, recorded in the report, that we as a city and a wider society need to take into account. But what I want to do now is I want to start dreaming with you. Let's speak about a vision for the future, using the recommendations of this report. And as we do that, let's think about, in general terms, what we need to ensure that we make this transition that the report talks about, from the informal to the formal sector. How do we do that as a city? How do we work towards that? Well, it seems to me that there are certain basic criteria that need to be present in any market. There are minimum conditions. They will vary from large markets to single vendor stalls. But there is a consistency right the way from the large sector down to the small stalls. And they are these. Firstly, and these might seem obvious, but if you go to our markets today, you will not see that they are present. But the first one is shelter. There needs to be cover. There need to be roofs over markets to protect the wares, to protect the vendors, to have a more attractive environment for purchasers, to protect everyone from heat, from sun, from rain, wares from rain, particularly food and perishable goods from rain. And so roofs are very important. Then secondly, and forgive me if it just seems trite and basic, but you've got to go through. Secondly, you need a smooth surface that you can clean easily. A rough surface is difficult to clean. It leads to unhygienic circumstances. So we need smooth concrete, ideally, as the base of a market. Then thirdly, we need clearly marked out bays. Comes back to the issue that you raised of people being charged $1 a day and the need for the city actually to get the revenue. We need marked out bays in both the large markets and even the single stall bays, so that there is absolute certainty and maps, and coming back to the website and all of that, the city knows exactly where its bays are throughout the city. They are all numbered. They all have a vendor attached to that particular bay with that particular number, so that there is certainty both for the city council and for the vendor. So marked out bays are critical. Then coming to the report, there needs to be access to water. Water for vendors and their customers to drink, water to enable vendors to clean their stalls adequately and to clean their wares. They might get vegetables in that need to be cleaned. There needs to be access to potable water. The next thing is access to toilets. Clearly, that needs to be, particularly in the large markets. That's not possible in the single vendors' stalls. But in the large and medium scale markets, it's critical that we have access to water and to, as I say, toilets. The next thing comes back to the issue of women and children. Now, once again, we can't do this in the smaller stalls, but in the larger stalls, we have to think about facilities for children. The ideal, and once again, I say, let's dream about this. Let's have a vision about this. Ideally, these large markets all should have basic creches so that children can go there, they can be adequately looked after, they are safe. It can even be an opportunity for them to be taught, not in a school, but certainly for children who are before school-going age to have access to books and basic toys. This needs to be our vision. So those, in my view, are the absolute basic necessities that should be certainly in all large markets. And as you scale down, obviously you can't have all those facilities. There are other things. Access to power. We need solar power in the larger markets to provide light, which is a security issue, but also to enable vendors to charge their cell phones. And for some vendors to be able to run their stalls. Some vendors need power to do that. One final thing, and I stress that I'm dreaming, but if you don't have a vision where you want to get to, but large markets need to have access to internet. I hope that the government finally allows companies like Starlink to operate in the country where you've got cheap, ready internet. But imagine if all our large markets had Wi-Fi, cheap Wi-Fi, how that would transform the lives of vendors and their customers. This is where we need to be headed. So if we are in agreement regarding those broad criteria, then let's apply that to the city. I'm going to start off with Ordini. Ordini, as you've seen, we've opened phase 1A. We're just about to move to phase 1B. And I'm pleased to tell you, are already starting to implement some of these measures in anticipation of the outcome of this report. The council, and Councillor Glover was here this morning, and I have been speaking to the contractors, and we've actually got them to change their plans for phase 1B. As good as phase 1A is, its original design didn't actually meet these basic criteria. The original design had individual stalls and little sort of Chinese pagodas that did not provide adequate cover, just that basic necessity that I was speaking about. In phase 1A, because the stalls had already been constructed, there was very little that we could do as a new council coming in, but we asked that they change their design so that at the very least it was completely covered, which they did. And it is working. You can see in phase 1A, it's there, it's operating now. The vendors who are there have complete cover and they have lockable bays. But moving to phase 1B, what we've now done is we've changed the design completely. And phase 1B, when it's built, you will see, consists of basically a large hall now. It is going to be completely covered with higher roofs, giving more ventilation, with the individual bays adequately marked within. It will have solar lighting, it has access to good toilets, and it is a much safer environment for vendors, their children, and for their customers. That's Ordini. What is our vision going forward? Well, what I've argued, and we now have a consensus within Council, is that around the periphery of the central business district, we needed at least 4 large markets. Ordini is the first. We want the second one to be at the intersection of 2nd Avenue and Lobengula Street. We've already cleared the ground there, but we need to do a lot more work in terms of the design and construction of a market. But that is our goal, to build a large-scale market at the corner of 2nd Avenue and Lobengula Street. Let me just come back to one point that I'd forgotten. The critical thing identified in the report regarding what makes for a successful market and what makes for an unsuccessful market are 3 critical things. You obviously need the vendors and their products. You need the customers. But critically, thirdly, you need something that acts as a magnet to get the customers to that particular venue. And the key thing in most is, of course, transport. And it is critical for, as we design these markets going forward, that we locate them where there are commuter omnibus services and taxis and the like, so that that acts as the magnet. And that's the key thing. If you look at 2nd Avenue and Lobengula Street, the site, there is an existing terminus there. It hasn't been used. In fact, it's been taken over by informal traders. But that needs to be resuscitated so that it then becomes another key point, a terminus for commuter omnibuses and the like. So number 2, to come back to this vision, number 1 is Ordini, number 2 is 2nd Avenue, number 3 is what we call the bend over, next to Highlanders. That is has a specific purpose, as we know. It is a clothing venue, but it too needs those basic conditions that I've spoken about. The roof, the smooth floor, the bays, access to water, functioning toilets, light, and ideally, as I say, internet. The 4th one, we want to locate somewhere on the east side of the city. My own personal preference is for the old Evelyn High School playing grounds between 1st Avenue and 4th Avenue to the east of Paranyatwa, to the west of the Machimhlophe River. Now, the problem for us as a council with that is that it is owned by government. It's owned by the Ministry of Education, and it's not that easy for us to be able to acquire that land and to use it. But that is the vision. And if we can persuade government, and I do now in this speech, persuade government to consider the allocation of that land. And once again, let's dream about that place. If you can imagine 2 or 3 large roofed markets there, ideally not just food markets, but markets where artists can come, basket weavers can come, painters, sculptors can come, and it then becomes a tourist venue as well. If we have a creche there, if we develop the gardens down to the river, it can be a delightful place. And then on the northern end, close to the Harare Road, to turn that into yet another bus terminus, and possibly an international bus terminus, or at the very least a regional bus terminus, so that buses going to Harare or Victoria Falls, Plumtree, actually go there. Those are the large-scale markets that we have in mind. Let me go down one step to smaller markets. We've spoken about Nkulumani, but what we want to do is develop 5 further smaller markets throughout the high-density suburbs. One of the things that has been identified in the report is the high percentage of vendors who live obviously in the high-density suburbs, who have to travel into town to Fifth Avenue at present. It remains absolutely logical in my mind to persuade vendors to remain close to where they live. But of course, we have to construct markets that meet those basic conditions. If you look at some of the markets that we've already developed as a city, you will see that they're not occupied and that the vendors are over the street next to the shops. Why? Because that's where the shade is. That's where the decent surface is. That's where there's more security for their children. And that is understandable. And so the challenge for us as a city is to develop roofed, properly floored, properly marked markets in at least 5 of these venues. Let me go to the final level, and that's what I call single vendor sites or small sites. These are located obviously in the high-density suburbs, but they're also located in the low-density suburbs. And allow me just to speak briefly about this need for us to strike a balance between the formal and informal sector. Let me give the example of Zonke Sizwe. Zonke Sizwe, as you know, is a formal sector shopping center. They have just in the last week written to me as mayor to complain about vendors who are on the periphery of Zonke Sizwe. You've got formal sector businesses like Food Lovers, for example, which pays its licenses. They pay their VAT, they pay a whole range of taxes. There is a huge capital investment in those businesses. And yet, right outside Zonke Sizwe, you've got fruit and vegetable sellers. And they are complaining that those sellers are not paying license fees, they are undermining their business. And it is a valid complaint. The challenge for us is to say to vendors, let us move you away from the formal sector shopping centers to areas where there are still sufficient population densities for you to be able to have a viable business. That's the challenge, and it's primarily a town planning challenge, but we've got to look at areas that are away from the formal shopping centers, where there are still population densities there, and develop something that, once again, meets those basic criteria. Now, you can't build a whole market, but coming back to this thing about vision and dreaming, one of the things I want to put out as a challenge to our engineering firms and to the City Council is for us as a City Council to design a basic stall, which will be a standardized stall with a steel frame, with a roof, perhaps an asbestos roof. I'm speaking directly to the Councillor Ndlovu here. And that becomes the regularized vending stall. And if you want to operate as a vendor, that is part of the deal. You have to, and you don't buy it immediately. We seek funding to get these properly constructed, a few meters wide, but sufficient for the vendor to be under shade with a table built into it for the display of wares with an asbestos roof and an area where the customer can come into shade to view the goods for sale. It can be movable, but the city then needs to identify vending sites throughout the city in low density and high density areas. It may be difficult to put a smooth concrete floor down in these areas, but at the very least, concrete pavers. And that vending stall goes on those pavers, on pre-designated sites that the city identifies and authorizes. And once again, is named and numbered, and the council knows how many there are throughout the city. And the deal with vendors is you pay the city a certain amount every month, then there's no harassment by the police or political parties or political players. But if you seek to conduct vending business outside of either the large-scale markets, the small-scale markets, or the individual stores, then you are going to see the full wrath of the law. And in that way, if we look at these three models going forward, and it's not going to happen overnight, I think that we might be able to regularize vending. We might be able to actually improve the business of vendors. If we site these little ones in areas where it's easy for cars to stop and close to where people live, it might enhance their business. It also will have the impact of beautifying the city. One of the things that distresses me is to see all the black plastic. I know that vendors don't like it either, but it is an eyesore. And it makes the city look untidy and unattractive. If we are able to move towards these basic steel structures with proper roofs, it is going to not only provide an acceptable working environment for vendors, but will also beautify the city and give it a much better appearance. So I stress that I'm dreaming. I hope with all of you. I hope that we have a vision for what is achievable within the next few years. I stress it won't happen overnight. But how do we get to that dream? And that's how I want to end it. And I want to come back to FES. There are only 2 councillors and a recalled councillor here today, I think. I don't see any other councillors. And it's all very well me speaking here, but what we need to do critically is to get the whole body of councillors on board with this and the management of council on board. And I think the first step is to take these recommendations, and I hope that FES might be prepared to arrange a similar function where we present this report to the council management and all our councillors, so that we develop a broad consensus about the very good recommendations that have come out of this report. That, in my mind, is absolutely critical going forward, so that when it comes to the amendment of bylaws that this speaks about, but also when it comes to budgetary issues and planning issues, we can start to plan together. So that's number 1 for FES. It's a request that you assist us in that regard. The second thing is something identified in the report, and that is the need for close communication and cooperation between the city and vendors' organizations. It's very difficult for us to deal with individual vendors because there are thousands, you have different interests. And I strongly encourage you to strengthen your vendors' associations so that we have more effective channels of communication, and also we have agreed standards. So when, for example, you talk about stringent penalties, that there's a broad consensus regarding that. That once the city has provided attractive marketing sites, we then inject discipline into our city. And it is done in a collaborative way, where we all agree this is all in our best interests, that vendors operate out of certain places in a certain manner, and that they pay their license fees to the city council, not to space barons or political parties or the like. That is critical going forward. And so I encourage your associations and whatever FES can do to strengthen those associations will be vital. So those are the two main things going forward. Let me end by addressing the question raised by the one gentleman about timelines. Thank you, Sue. I want to repeat what I said just now. This isn't going to happen overnight. Ordini is going full steam ahead. We need, as a city, to get the funding to build the 2nd Avenue, Lobengula Street. I'm already speaking to private corporates to see whether they won't come in on a similar basis to Ordini. But also that the council clearly needs to find its own resources. And I'll be frank with you, in the context of the water challenges that we are facing in the city, our resources in the short term, at least this year, are focused on trying to address the water crisis. The problem with that is that realistically, unless we get private sector involvement in the development of these large-scale markets, I can't see us being able to go beyond Ordini this year. But certainly within the next year or two, I would hope that the city can get at least 3 or 4 markets developed. To the 5 smaller scale markets, once again, we face the same financial challenges. But coming back to FES, it may be that there are models in other countries where we can work closely with the private sector. And one of your suggestions about the mix, where you've got a chicken in and you have a market close by, it may be that we can work with private sector companies for them to do a food court, and part of the deal is building a smaller scale market right close. It seems to me it could be a win-win environment. Regarding the smaller stalls and the time frame for that, I'm hoping that this goes beyond this meeting. I want to challenge the engineering firms in the city. We've got many structural civil engineers. It would be nice to see some designs made to do a costing on that. And I think that is low-hanging fruit. I think it wouldn't be extremely expensive for us, at the very least, to start pilot schemes where we start identifying vending sites, smaller single vending sites throughout the city, and to, as a pilot, start getting these smaller vending sites manufactured and located. Let me end. I want to come back to where I started. This issue, particularly in 5th Avenue, has been a major headache. It's been a major headache for the City Council. It has been exploited by unscrupulous people, by politicians, by political parties who've made it political issues of it. If our broader vision for this city, of a beautiful city that attracts more investment both domestically and internationally, is to be realized, it is critically that we clean up the central part of the city and the city as a whole. But we cannot clean it up unless we have this new consensus with the informal vendors who are not there by choice. They've been compelled to go there. But together, I believe if we work with goodwill in a collaborative and constructive spirit, we can transform the city, not just for the formal sector, but for the informal sector and the most vulnerable people in our society.